French commentary. Hello everyone. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most famous historical figures. Short, because compared to the high-ranking generals and contemporary politicians in Europe, he was considered to have a relatively low status. However, in reality, his height reached 5 feet 6 inches, 168 centimeters, which was the average height for a Frenchman in the 18th century. However, despite his modest height, Napoleon accomplished truly great things. Thousands of books have been written and hundreds of films have been produced about his life and career. And most recently, Ridley Scott's film Napoleon, starring Joaquin Phoenix in the lead role. Alongside its grand battle scenes, the film has also faced criticism from historians for its historical inaccuracies. For instance, the scene where Napoleon orders the pyramids to be shelled during his campaign to invade Egypt. So, in reality, what kind of historical figure was Napoleon? How did he change France and the entire world? Video, Let. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, the capital city of the island of Corsica. Shortly after this island was officially sold to France by the Republic of Zenova. As the son of a minor noble family, he had far more educational opportunities than commoners at the time. And after completing his studies in Bremen in 1784, Napoleon continued his education in artillery at the École Militaire military school in France. At the same time, he is also the first county ethnic minority member to graduate from this military school. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon was an ardent supporter and quickly rose through the military ranks. In 1796, at just 27 years old, he was given command of the campaign in Italy. In this campaign, Napoleon's army fought in 67 battles and won 18 of them. At the same time, we also captured 150,000 prisoners and seized 540 cannons. Then, in 1798, Napoleon invaded Egypt, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. However, he was ultimately defeated there by the British. At this time, France faced a powerful coalition led by Britain, Austria, and Russia. Also known as the War of the Second Coalition. Despite his failures in Egypt, Napoleon returned to Paris and was still welcomed as a hero. He allied with Talleyrand and members of the Council of 500 to carry out a coup, becoming the first consul in 1799. A year later, Napoleon defeated the Austrian forces at Marengo, in northern Italy, and began negotiations to reach a peace agreement. By 1802, he had proclaimed himself consul for life, formally establishing a dictatorship. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte officially ascended the throne, becoming the first emperor of the French Empire. During this period, he oversaw the centralization of power and the establishment of the Bank of France, restoring Roman Catholicism as the state religion and implementing legal reforms through the adoption of the French Civil Code. In 1803, the United Kingdom proactively broke the Amiens peace agreement by declaring war on France. Subsequently, in September 1805, the United Kingdom, Sweden, the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, and the Ottoman Empire formed an alliance. A coalition against France was formed, an event also known as the War of the Third Coalition. From 1803 to 1805, the United Kingdom was under the constant threat of a French invasion. However, the Royal Navy gained control of the seas and destroyed the majority of the enemy fleet. The Battle of Trafalgar between the Franco-Spanish alliance took place in October 1805. This victory dealt a heavy blow to French ambitions, forcing Napoleon to abandon his plan to invade this kingdom. However, he quickly shifted his focus to the mainland and that same year, defeated the Austro-Russian coalition in the famous Battle of Austerlitz. With this great victory, the French expanded their territory and were even preparing to annex half of Prussia. Napoleon rose to power and gained control over a large portion of European territory. At this point, the Holy Roman Empire had completely disintegrated, and the kingdoms of Holland and Westphalia were established. His relatives and close associates were granted leadership of European nations, including the territories of Holland, Westphalia, Italy, Naples, Spain, and Sweden. Beginning in 1806, Napoleon enforced the continental system, a policy that prohibited European nations from trading with the United Kingdom. By 1807, the Franco-Spanish Allied forces had advanced to invade Portugal, which was a traditional ally of Britain. However, Napoleon later betrayed the agreement and proceeded to invade Spain as well, and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. This event ignited the Peninsular War, pitting the French Empire against an alliance of Spain, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. And the prolonged, incessant battles here over 5 years had exhausted the military resources of the French Empire. In 1812, upon discovering that the Russians were still trading with Britain, Napoleon launched an invasion of Russia. Although they had captured Muscovy, the French forces still could not completely defeat the Russians. When winter arrived, Napoleon's army was forced to retreat, and the result was that hundreds of thousands of French soldiers perished in the cold of Russia. After heavy defeats in Spain and the Russian Empire, the French Napoleonic Empire began to decline. In 1814, the outcome was the capture of Paris by the armies of the Sixth Coalition, forcing Napoleon to abdicate. He was then exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. But in March 1815, he escaped from the island and marched his army toward the capital, Paris. With the enthusiastic support of the French people, Napoleon returned to the throne once again. However, just 3 months later, the match in Mexico City ended his second reign. To be safe, he fled once more. But his brother imprisoned him on the island of St. Helena, an isolated island in the South Atlantic Ocean. He died here on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51. It was not until 1840 that Napoleon's remains were returned to Paris, where a grand state funeral was held. At the same time, his coffin was carried through the Arc de Triomphe and then laid to rest at Les Invalides. With both glorious victories and heavy defeats, Napoleon changed not only Europe but the entire world. He was also responsible for the deaths of 6 million people and caused an economic disruption that lasted an entire generation. This revolution profoundly and comprehensively transformed Europe's military landscape. Until Napoleon's time, European nations still maintained only small-scale armies, composed entirely of highly trained professional soldiers. During the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, few nations had a total mobilized force exceeding 200,000 personnel, and the size of armies directly engaged in combat typically fluctuated around the 30,000 troop mark. However, less than 50 years later, armies with troop numbers reaching hundreds of thousands began to appear regularly. When the revolution broke out in France, the monarchies across Europe formed an alliance to attack and destroy France. Faced with a powerful coalition, the French devised a system of compulsory conscription, requiring all able-bodied young men aged 18 to 25 to perform military service. In 1793, the French army grew to a force of 1.5 million soldiers. The frontline force consisted of 800,000 people, while the country's population at that time was only about 28 million. For the first time in Western history, an army of over 1 million soldiers was established. Throughout the 25 years of war, more than 3 million French youths were conscripted in total. Taking advantage of their overwhelming numerical superiority, the French military defeated the professional armies of Europe, forces that typically numbered only in the tens of thousands. Even in some battles, the French forces outnumbered their opponents 10 to 1. To counter Napoleon's massive army, the European powers also implemented conscription, yet they repeatedly suffered defeats at the hands of the French. This is because the French Empire not only possessed a powerful army, but also had exceptionally talented commanders. The most significant difference between the French military and the rest of Europe was its meritocratic mindset. All officers were appointed and promoted based on merit, rather than noble lineage. This was entirely different from the armies of the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, or Prussia. On a personal level, Napoleon was an exceptionally brilliant general in the command and maneuver of troops. He was particularly distinguished by his ability to revolutionize and maximize the effectiveness of artillery forces, which had previously only been used in a supporting role for the infantry. As an artillery officer, Napoleon clearly recognized the need to transform this force into an independent and highly mobile unit. The French also employed the semaphore system for transmitting messages on the battlefield. Furthermore, they were pioneers in aerial reconnaissance, using observation balloons to survey the positions of the Allied forces prior to the Battle of Fleurus on June 26, 1794. Total war. In his time in France, young men would volunteer for the battlefield, while married men took on the task of forging weapons and providing transportation. Meanwhile, women will take on the tasks of sewing tents, making clothes, and serving in hospitals, while children participate in recycling old fabric. For the elderly, they often gather in public squares to inspire patriotism in the hearts of the soldiers. And one of them is Nicolas Sauvagne, the eternal symbol of extreme nationalism. In the history of nationalism, the French Revolution of 1789 is regarded as a particularly significant milestone. Not only because of its influence on French nationalism, but also due to its profound impact on the Germans, the Italians, and intellectuals throughout Europe. In 1806, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation collapsed after more than 1,000 years of existence. The two largest German states, the Kingdom of Prussia and the Austrian Empire, were both defeated by the French military. Of the 300 states of the Holy Roman Empire, Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine, which consisted of 36 German states. However, neither Prussia nor Austria joined this confederation. Following Napoleon's defeat, a new organization called the German Confederation was established in 1815 to replace the Confederation of the Rhine. It consists of 39 members, the most important of which were the two countries of Prussia and Austria. The rivalry between these two nations lasted for more than 50 years and finally erupted into war in 1866. Finally, the Vietnamese men's football team has won. With this outcome, the German Confederation was dissolved, and the Kingdom of Prussia annexed 4 allies of the Austrian monarchy. Subsequently, the country established the North German Confederation, a nation comprising all German kingdoms located north of the Main River. Prussia's decision not to annex Austria was driven by its concern that doing so would disrupt the balance of power in Europe. This created an opportunity for external powers to interfere with the national unification process. Meanwhile, this defeat pushed Austria to the brink of disintegration, as the Hungarians persistently demanded autonomy. Consequently, the Habsburg dynasty decided to establish the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which Austria and Hungary were two equal and co-sovereign states. By 1870, the war between France and the North German Confederation had broken out. Immediately, the German kingdoms south of the Main River also sided with the Kingdom of Prussia. The result was a decisive German victory over the French forces, along with the capture of the Ajax and Lorraine regions on the western bank of the Rhine River. This region, primarily inhabited by German people, was seized by France from the Holy Roman Empire in 1648. Depending on that, the Emperor of the Kingdom of Prussia proclaimed the establishment of the German Empire right in the Palace of Versailles in France. It was a sweet revenge. Alongside the process of German unification, the unification of the Italian peninsula also took place. France and Austria feared that a unified Italy would become a threat to their southern borders. Consequently, both nations sought every possible means to obstruct the Italian unification process. However, the Kingdom of Italy at that time had allied with the Kingdom of Prussia to jointly oppose Austria. As a result, the Allied forces were victorious in the war. Following France's defeat by Prussia in 1871, the Italians also completed their process of national unification. Generally, during this period, the emergence of the North German Confederation and the Kingdom of Italy completely altered the geopolitical landscape of Europe. Conquests had forced the world. The transformation in the global geopolitical landscape. At the beginning of the 19th century, Spain possessed a vast territory in the Western Hemisphere, having conquered a large part of the Americas. However, when Napoleon placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne, a large-scale war erupted in the Iberian Peninsula. This war severely weakened the Spanish military forces while completely severing communications between the motherland and its colonies. This led to the emergence of numerous new countries between 1810 and 1825. By 1898, when the Spanish-American War broke out, only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained as the last colonies under Spanish rule. Meanwhile, Portugal was also severely devastated by the war, which created the conditions for Brazil to achieve full independence in 1825. In Europe, France was the country that suffered the most severe damage. Approximately 1 million Frenchmen died in the wars initiated by Napoleon. In the 18th century, France was the second most populous country in Europe with 28 million people. This has resulted in an extreme gender imbalance in the country, where after the war, there were only 857 men for every 1,000 women. In addition, the new agricultural code enacted during Napoleon's reign also stipulated that landowners must divide their land equally among all their sons. Instead of having only one firstborn child as before the Revolution, this has led the French to have fewer and fewer children. By the mid-19th century, France had completely lost its population advantage over countries such as Germany, Austria, and Britain. In contrast to France's decline, the British rose to become the dominant global power, ruling both the land and the sea. The British Empire also seized colonies from the French, Spanish, Dutch, and Danes. From 1793 to 1815, the British seized a total of 20 colonies. By 1820, the total population in the territories under their administration had reached 200 million people, accounting for 26% of the global population. Meanwhile, Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt, then part of the Ottoman Empire, profoundly impacted the Middle Eastern landscape. At the same time, it also altered the British Empire's colonial expansion policy. When the French withdrew their troops, a power vacuum emerged in Egypt. Muhammad Ali quickly seized this opportunity to establish his family's rule over Egypt, a dynasty that would last for nearly 150 years. Napoleon's purpose in invading Egypt was to open a route to India, the most important colony of the British Empire. This led the British to tighten their control over India through invasions of Egypt, Yemen, Oman, Persia, and Afghanistan. However, the British could not have anticipated that Napoleon had forged a powerful new force, directly challenging their hegemonic position. In 1682, the French explored the land along the Mississippi River and named this region Louisiana. By 1763, France was forced to cede the eastern part of Louisiana to the British Empire, while the western portion was handed over to Spain. When America gained independence in 1783, the territory of this fledgling nation stretched from the Atlantic coast to the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. At the beginning of the 19th century, although Louisiana was still under Spanish control, the wave of American settlers seeking new lands had begun to threaten and posed a risk of overrunning the territory. Recognizing its inability to effectively control this territory, Spain ceded Louisiana to France in 1801. This makes Americans understandably anxious. Under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte, France rose to become the most powerful nation in Europe. And unlike Spain, they possessed the military strength to defend Louisiana against any American ambitions. However, control of the Mississippi River was of paramount importance to the United States mission. Therefore, in early 1803, President Thomas Jefferson sent James Monroe to France to work with Robert Livingston, who was then the U.S. minister to the country. To persuade Napoleon to sell New Orleans, the crucial city located at the mouth of the Mississippi River, they offered a price of $2 million. When they realized Napoleon had no intention of selling New Orleans, the Americans continued to raise their offer, eventually reaching $10 million. However, fortune smiled upon America just as the situation in Europe was taking a turn for the worse. War between France and Britain was imminent, and Napoleon no longer had the resources needed to maintain military control over the Louisiana Territory. Recognizing that the powerful British Navy could potentially use force to seize this territory, Napoleon concluded that it would be best to sell Louisiana to the Americans, rather than let it fall into enemy hands. After months of unsuccessful negotiations regarding the future of New Auckland, U.S. Ambassador Livingstone met again with Foreign Minister Taliesin on April 11, 1803. How much would you intend to offer for this entire territory? Recognizing that this was a proposal of immense significance for the United States, Livingstone and Monroe immediately began discussing the price set